Glad to be back. And just to give you a brief sense of what we're going to do this morning, I'm going to offer up an overview of the turbulent 60s and 70s from a national perspective, some of the big stuff that's going on. And then Cordelia will take it and think a little bit more about sort of the church in particular, St. James, but also the National Episcopal Church. And we're going to focus largely on issues of civil rights. Originally, Cordelia was going to do a separate session next week on women and spirituality, but we decided we've got so much to talk about here that we're going to focus on civil rights this time, and next time we'll do more as far as women's rights, sexuality, things of that sort. So we're going to split this over 2 weeks. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay, great. So, I'm going to start by noting that this is a time period, as I'm sure most of you are aware, many of you lived through this, and that has a whole lot of things that are going on, tremendous changes that are taking place in American civic and social life. And of course, those changes impact St. James, they impact the broader church in all kinds of ways. So my job in the next 10 or 12 minutes is to try and work through the broader picture of that. It's a sort of impossible task, but we can do the best we can do. So I want to start by thinking about sort of 5 snapshots that speak to the changes going on in civil rights in the United States. And each snapshot representing what I think are important innovations, changes, trends that deal with civil rights. The first snapshot features this guy. And who do we have here on the far right? Yeah, Jackie Robinson. Most people wouldn't start civil rights with Jackie Robinson, but I'm not most people. And I think Jackie Robinson is a very interesting figure for this. Jackie Robinson takes the field for the Brooklyn Dodgers in what year? 1947, that's right. And I spotlight this because if we want to think about civil rights, too often people think about civil rights, the civil rights movement beginning in the mid-1950s, but there's a much longer history behind that. And Jackie Robinson's debut in 1947, baseball then was the most popular team sport in the United States, which is sort of hard to believe given its declining popularity these days. But in any event, it was the most popular sport in those days, a national pastime. So for the first black player to take the field in 1947 was tremendously significant. It was a cultural milestone, and it indicated some sort of profound shift that was going on in terms of race. I'll also mention, just as a way of tying back to my forum from a couple weeks ago, Jackie Robinson's debut in 1947 comes as a large part as a result of World War II. The sense of the United States fighting a war against a sort of hateful, racist, fascist country motivated some people to think differently about whether the United States was living up to its democratic possibilities. To give you a sense of that, there had been a long push for black baseball players in Major League Baseball. The Commissioner of Baseball had always steadfastly pushed back against that. Kennesaw Mountain Landis, when he dies in the middle of World War II, he is succeeded by a guy named Happy Chandler, who was a Southern man himself. I can't remember if he's from Kentucky or Tennessee, one or the other. But a Southern man, and the black press went to him and said, would you permit a black baseball player? And his response was, hell, if a black man is good enough to die in Guadalcanal, he's good enough to play baseball. Right? So this idea that World War II is this transformative event and begins to push a sort of change in racial norms. Second snapshot, does anyone know who this is? Thurgood Marshall, that's right. And Thurgood Marshall, what do we know about Thurgood Marshall? First African-American Supreme Court Justice, that's right. I put Marshall up here, though. I think, Cordelia, you're going to talk about Marshall in a little bit, too. But I put Marshall up here because prior to becoming the first Supreme Court Justice, he was also the lead counsel for the NAACP, and in fact is the lead lawyer who launched the case of Brown versus Board of Education. That, of course, leads to the end of segregated education in the United States. The Supreme Court's 9-0 verdict that segregated education is unequal and therefore unconstitutional. And again, just to think about the long time period of this, Brown versus Board of Education comes in 1954, but it was the culmination of a campaign that had begun in the early 1930s. The NAACP began conducting court cases challenging segregation in education. And it was case after case chipping away that finally resulted in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. So there we have a kind of legal, we have a cultural change, we have a legal change. This woman is, of course,
Rosa Parks.
Rosa Parks, that's right. Rosa Parks, we might know for her role in the Montgomery bus boycott. And Rosa Parks, the story often goes with Rosa Parks that this was a tired old woman who one day decided not to give up her seat to a white passenger, and therefore was thrown in jail. And the African American community began a bus boycott in the city of Montgomery thereafter. That is in some ways true, but it also, I want to spotlight Rosa Parks for a couple of reasons here. This event takes place in December 1955, so it's about 1 year after Brown versus Board of Education. It also takes place in the aftermath of the Emmett Till verdict, where the murderers of Emmett Till are found not guilty. And Rosa Parks was deeply troubled by that and wanted to do something. Rosa Parks was also not just a tired old woman who'd had enough. This was somebody who planned this out in advance. She was actually a trained advocate for the NAACP. She had investigated sexual assault cases against black women for more than a decade. She had been trained as an activist. She was deliberate in her attempt. She knew that this would create a public stir. And also, when Rosa Parks is thrown in jail, the group that's largely responsible for making the bus boycott happen, the people who print the leaflets, the people who push their ministers to champion this boycott are black women. It is women 100% who make the bus boycott happen. And that's often forgotten in our sort of history of civil rights here. So just wanted to call attention to that. Yeah?
Integration in the military in 1948 by Truman.
Yeah, and we talked about the integration of the military back in our World War II thing a few weeks ago, no problem. But yeah, you're right, that's another sort of step in this process here that I think is interesting, right? Baseball gets integrated before the U.S. military gets integrated, and I think that's worth noting here. So the Montgomery bus boycott kicks off December 1955. They decide they need a public spokesman for the movement. They decide to have a young minister who hasn't been intimidated by the power structure be that public spokesperson, and that's how Martin Luther King Jr. becomes a sort of public figure, just driven by that. And of course, he's a good speaker too, so that helps. But again, I'm just interested in particular thinking about women driving that bus, as it were, pardon the pun. And the bus boycott, of course, is successful after about a year.
Right. Just a comment on Thurgood Marshall.
Yeah.
Baltimore Washington Airport is also named after him.
That's right. Yeah, BWI fairly recently, I think, was renamed for Marshall. I think it was fairly recent that it was renamed for Marshall. Yeah. Okay, for a snapshot, I'm going to ask who these people are because we probably don't know their names, but where is this? Do we know?
Greensboro.
Yeah, that's right. This is the Woolworth in Greensboro, the start of the sit-in movements. In February of 1964, college students from Greensboro A&T College and HBCU in Greensboro did spontaneously decide to sit down at the lunch counter of the Woolworth. African Americans could eat from Woolworths. They could order from the takeout counter, but they were not permitted to sit at the lunch counter. These four men the night before had been trying to think of a way to get involved in civil rights activism, and they decided the next day to do this. They didn't tell anybody, they just went and did it. Asked to be served, were refused, and sat there for the rest of the day. The next day, 27 people showed up to Woolworth to continue their efforts. In the days that followed, in countless towns across the South, college students in particular began flocking to restaurants to engage in sit-in protests. And again, that's 1960. This marks the real entrance of college students into civil rights activism with this, in significant numbers. And it leads to the formation of a group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, usually abbreviated as SNCC, which comes as a result of this. So that's another spotlight or snapshot just to think about how students begin to get involved. And last but not least, where do we think this is taking place? No, good guesses. Lots of people marching. Yeah, there we go, Washington, D.C. This is, very good lead. You didn't even have advance notice of that. It's true. This is from the March on Washington in August of 1963, led by, of course, you probably can't see here, but this is Martin Luther King Jr. in the front here. In the March on Washington, I'll spotlight, because of the role of the black clergy, Martin Luther King Jr., of course, as a Christian minister, he forms a group called the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is made up of black Christian ministers dedicated to fighting for social justice, particular civil rights issues. And this is a kind of culminating effort. There's a lot of stuff that SCLC does prior to this. I think one or two people may have mentioned Birmingham, Alabama, for example, a huge campaign led by SCLC in the spring of '63, so a few months prior to the March on Washington. SCLC targeted Birmingham, had a very segregated downtown that did not allow African Americans to purchase equally, but also did not employ black people. And so SCLC conducted a series of protests and marches. Many of the leaders of that are thrown in prison, including Martin Luther King Jr. While Martin Luther King Jr. was in jail, he became aware of a letter that had been written by white clergy, 8 white clergy, critical of King, although they didn't name him. They're critical of him for, as they saw it, sort of stirring up trouble, not going through the courts, engaging in this mass protest, which they thought was sort of inappropriate. And that inspired King to write his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, in which he essentially said that the time for waiting is over. Things need to happen. Things need to be done. And that to sit passively by was tantamount to supporting the status quo, to being okay with racism. So he's very critical of these white Christian ministers who are critical of him. And by the way, the top name on that letter that criticizes Martin Luther King Jr. is the Bishop of the Episcopal Church in Alabama. So, on the wrong side of history there. That gives us a sense, and there's a whole lot more we could talk about with civil rights. I'm going to just go to one more slide here and talk a little bit about black power, which emerges in the wake of civil rights, and then I'll turn it over to Cordelia. So, black power. Black power I find really important. I gotta stay in the camera. Black power I find really important and interesting for a number of reasons. The phrase black power first gains widespread use in 1966. Anyone know who that is? Stokely Carmichael. There we go. Stokely Carmichael, who was the head of SNCC in 1966, first uses that phrase at a rally in Selma, Alabama. Stokely Carmichael had been thrown in jail for the 27th time for his participation in peaceful protests and marches, and he had enough. And he begins to see, says, what do we need? We need black power. It's a phrase that comes to dominate media coverage. What do we think of when we think of black power? Anything come to mind? Any images? The fist, yeah, we think about the medal stand salute, the 1968 Olympics. Malcolm X, somebody said over there. Black Panthers might be another thing that comes to mind, right? Black power meant a whole lot of things to a whole lot of people. But in general, black power was a more aggressive shift in terms of thinking about rights. And it's not just about sort of legal, political rights, but about changing ideas regarding culture, getting people to rethink cultural bias. And in fact, many of the accomplishments of black power come in the realm of education. Stokely Carmichael uses black power in 1966. The first black studies program is founded in 1968. It's at San Francisco State University. African American history courses start to get more coverage in classes. Hollywood film begins to change, right? We get a movie like Shaft in the early 1970s. The idea that you have a tough-talking, black, heroic, violent guy, that was unprecedented in Hollywood film prior to the early 1970s. So there's cultural transformations. And this aggressive tone, this idea of sort of challenging culture, I'm spotlighting it because it also spills out beyond the African American community and influences a wide range of groups, including Native Americans, which we have the occupation of Alcatraz in 1970, which, if you ever go to Alcatraz, you can see the graffiti still there. But a wide range of groups, the Chicano movement, again, this sort of more aggressive, more radical shift in terms of race. And I'm going to leave it there and turn it over to Cordelia.
Great. So as Greg said, when we conceived of this forum in the 60s and 70s, civil rights, gender, sexuality, and obviously us being a Episcopal Church and St. James, about liturgical change and church membership. As we worked on this, we realised we had too much interesting material, and so have decided to do it over 2 weeks. I want to say before I start my presentation, which is largely going to be around race and civil rights and the Episcopal Church, that it's very early research, and I'm looking forward to having some quiet time, your time, at the end to see what I don't know about St. James and that you might share from your own experiences. As Greg has said, this is a very turbulent time for the nation, and it's also a turbulent time for the church and for the church that we all know and love here at St. James. And so to bring the subject down closer to home, I want to start by just reading something that was written in 1970 by a member of St. James, the author of the history that came out then that covered the years 1945 to 1970. And in the epilogue that he wrote as following: "In a world seemingly characterized by moral degradation, drug addiction, and venomous hatred, marked by social convulsions, racial ferment, and arrogant self-righteousness, and noted for demonstrations, a euphemism for arson, assault, vandalism, and bombings, in such a world, can the Christian Church survive? Does St. James have a future?" And he found an answer to this in the 2 great commandments of Jesus. As he put it in language of the prayer book of the time: "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God, and thou shalt love thy neighbour as thyself." Those were the prisms in which he saw the future of St. James, if it was going to have a future. So I want to think about those things as we think about where the national church is around race and where St. James was during this period. Greg has talked about civil rights, and we'll talk about how the Episcopal Church saw that as a national church. But the first thing to say about this subject is the church itself had a problem. The church was quite segregated. We're a national church in the south as well as the north, and obviously we reflect something of where we live and our politics of our locality. In the early 1930s, there was a study done of all the churches of the country to see how many African Americans belonged to them. And it found that in the Episcopal Church, 2% of our churches were black churches, quite literally black churches, and they were in the urban areas. And about 1% of our churches in the rural areas were black majority churches as well. And as Greg said, the war was a huge turning point for lots of thinking around identity and especially race. And out of that, for the Episcopal Church grew a national council which was going to look and hold this brief of how the church, as it said at the time, sort of engaged with Negroes, as African Americans were commonly called at that time. And so it set up a ministry sort of team that was going to promote African Americans as ministers, but also would work to break down segregation within the church. Segregation started right at the beginning of sort of church life, if you like. Our seminaries were actually segregated. You couldn't go to VTS, Virginia Theological Seminary, if you were African American until 1951. There were separate colleges for you. There was also a huge battle over this within the church, and actually people went to the courts over this. The most famous or infamous case was in the University of the South in Swanee. The protagonists went several rounds on that, trying to get the trustees to admit people to theological training who were African American. So it was a really live issue within the Episcopal Church. And it wasn't only the seminaries that were segregated. Our diocesan conventions often were, especially in the South. There was one for African Americans, and there was one for the white people. And in some dioceses, in Arkansas and in, I think, South Carolina, there was actually a separate bishop for the black population. So a church with its own flaws, its own beams in its own eyes. Having said that, there were prominent Episcopalians who were involved early in the civil rights movement. Greg has already mentioned Thurgood Marshall. He was an Episcopalian involved in the landmark ruling on Brown versus the Board of Education, which opened the way to desegregation of schools. One of the judges who was instrumental in challenging the idea of the separate but equal idea of education was Episcopalian. And you probably don't know who this is, but you'll get extra points if you do know who this woman is on the right. Anybody got any ideas? Oh, wow. I'm very impressed. This is Pauline Murray, who was a lawyer by training, and she provided a lot of the evidence for the Board of Education case. She then went on to be, as you can see, an Episcopalian woman priest in 1977, one of the earliest ones, and she was also involved in some of the early gay rights discussions in the Episcopal Church. In terms of General Convention, our decision-making body, throughout the 50s we see a series of resolutions condemning racial prejudice and calling on the Church to support efforts in the South for desegregation. As Greg has also told you, the Episcopal Church wasn't united on this issue. The Bishop of Alabama being an example of that. Especially when the sit-in protest started, he was really vehemently against that, just saying that they were another word for lawlessness. But other people disagreed. We have women, wives of Episcopal bishops, who actually take part in the sit-ins and get arrested. So a wide range of actions and behaviour. The climax of the civil rights movement, as we know, is often seen as the Great March in 1965 in Selma, Alabama, and a lot of Episcopalians do join in that. It's reckoned about 500 of that crowd are Episcopal, and at that time the local church is segregated, and they try and desegregate that by their presence, initially unsuccessfully. One of the people involved in trying to desegregate St. Paul's Church is this man, Jonathan Daniels. He was a seminarian from Episcopal Theological College in Massachusetts, and he stays in Selma registering black voters after that demonstration, and he is murdered in August '65. And he is being recognised by the Episcopal Church as a martyr, and his name is listed in the list of martyrs in our calendar of lesser feasts and fasts. I think it's in August that he is commemorated the date of his death. So where is St. James in all of this? I think it's fair to say, and this is only from my research, so I stand to be corrected, that largely in the 50s and 60s we are, perhaps typically of Episcopal churches, expressing our views through our liturgy. From 1945, from time to time, there's lots of interracial services where we invite the congregation of the Bethel AME to come and join us, especially their choir, and to hear a sermon on occasion from an African-American chaplain at Indian Town Gap. We're also funding renovations and repairs in what are called the Negro churches of Lancaster, Ebenezer Baptist, and again Bethel AME. We're also making links with Lincoln University at this time, which is an African-American university. We invite their choir here from time to time, and in 53 we have some theatre that's put on by their college students. I don't really know what Sleep of Prisoners is. I know it's a poem. If anyone can inform me more, I need to do some more research on that. But I find it fascinating. These seem to be the only photos in the archives I found that have African Americans in them until recently. As you can see, church was looked a little different in '53 than it does today. Obviously, darker wood was a popular choice of church decoration. So that's what's really going on in the 50s and 60s largely. Having said that, we financially support F&M's program of pre-college enrichment, which is directed to black students. And we also have the opportunity through the Lancaster County Council of Churches to voice our collective views on racial discrimination at this time. And it's very interesting that in 1960, when the vestry was given the chance to collectively sign up to this covenant that the council was promoting, it very much made it an individual choice for St. James members. And I'd like to read you what they were asked to affirm, just because it's really interesting. So, churches should invite and welcome the attendance of all persons, regardless of race and social status. Residential patterns, regardless of race or social status, should be promoted. People should welcome new neighbours, regardless of race, and should not sell their homes to escape integration. Furthermore, all people should inform their present neighbours of their viewpoint and try to persuade them to take similar actions. All persons should be employed solely on the basis of qualifications and not on the basis of race. All organisations and all recreational facilities, such as swimming pools, should avoid discriminatory practices. So the vestry as a group weren't happy about that, and I'm sure as former vestry members or current vestry members, you are often wary of collective statements of good works and good intentions. So I'd be interested to hear your personal reflections on that sort of thing. But 28 people in the parish did sign up to that. I don't know which 28, but it's an interesting number. As I say, I'm still at the beginning of research on this. The big issue, as far as I can see in Lancaster County around segregation, was the swimming pool issue. And I haven't found any, so far, any St. James statement or action around that. So we'll see what comes out or what other people remember. So civil rights, in a way, peak is 1965 with the passing of the Act, which gives basic political rights to everyone. But as we know, in the late 60s, economic and social problems still remain, and there are riots, especially in the major cities, in Detroit and Newark being examples. And this is where the Episcopal Church is strong, in these cities. In the mid-60s, we have a new presiding bishop who comes from Texas, and he's very taken with the responsibility of the Episcopal Church speaking out and actually perhaps doing something about some of these economic and social injustices. And he introduced a very radical program in which the Episcopal Church gives $9 million over 3 years to what is called the empowerment of the nation's poorest citizens. And this almost unanimously gets through General Convention. It is problematic. People giving out the money are white people. There are no African Americans involved in the leadership on this or the administration of this. And it gives rise to the Union of Black Episcopalians who feel very angry and betrayed that white people are trying to decide what black people's problems are and solve them. There's also a lot of opposition from conservative bishops who don't think the Episcopal Church should be doing this sort of thing and think it's political and therefore a bad thing. We then get to General Convention in 1969, a year which is sort of the height of a lot of turmoil and distress in the nation, and it is the Episcopal Church. They have their sort of public meltdown, shall we say, in 1969 at their General Convention. African Americans protest at the convention, asking for reparations from the churches and synagogues for past injustices, and General Convention comes to a halt over that, and as people decide not to really engage with the issue, and there's a walkout by African American Episcopal members. At the same time as the height of the Vietnam War, there's also a protest by some military deserters there, and that again brings the whole Episcopal Church into distress and division. By the early 70s, though, there is something of a sort of conservative backlash against all of this. The numbers of Episcopalians is declining, the budget for many things is declining along with membership, and the conservative bishops are very unhappy about the whole idea of the national church interfering in their diocese, giving money often to organisations which have nothing to do with the Episcopal Church. So that whole programme of empowerment comes to an end largely in the Episcopal Church. But other things are happening in the church. The church is becoming more diverse in this period. African Americans make up about 5% in the early 70s of membership, and there's a whole commitment to training African Americans through ministry, so that by the sort of end of the 80s, early 90s, we have 13 bishops who are African American, and quite a large proportion of priests as well, relatively speaking. And of course, one of them is Nathan Baxter, who is known and loved by many of us here. So that's very much a sort of whistle-stop tour of my understanding of our position as a church around race over these turbulent years. I'd be very interested, as I say, to hear from you, your experiences, where my gaps are, and please feel free to share anything about Greg or my presentation. Thank you.